I don't trick or treat anymore. That doesn't sound entirely uncommon, does it? If anything, it makes me sound like a perfectly reasonable adult. Unfortunately, this is far from a reasonable story. What I should say is that I don't open my door to children anymore. I'm checking the blinds before any time I head outside or crack a window or hold a conversation through the mail drop slot on the door. Maybe some red flags have gone up in the neighborhood. I don't care. You know the Michael Jordan meme about the kids? That perfectly summarizes my feelings. See, now this sounds a little more extreme than a 40-year-old who's canceled Halloween. That's good. You need to be willing to accept the extreme if you're going to listen to the rest of this story. Halloween 2016. I'd tell you that I live in Chicago, but then we'd have to get into regional semantics. Just know I'm in the northern suburbs, about 40 minutes outside the city. Halloween in my neighborhood used to be nice. The locals go pretty hard with lights and decorations. The same guy runs a little fun-sized haunted house out of his garage every year. Nice neighborhood, nice weather, nice holiday. I was geared up and ready to do my part. Sitting on the couch, rewatching a classic vampire flick with periodic stops to the front door to shovel out chocolate for the kids. In 2016, I even wore plastic teeth. I popped them in before opening the door and gave every child who stopped by my best count impression. I may have looked more Sesame Street than Bram Stoker, but what can you do? 7 in the evening rolled around, the cutoff time in our neighborhood, and I started to shut it all down. Porch lights off, candy bowl back in the kitchen where I could scavenge from its brim for the next month. Then came the familiar rapping of tiny knuckles against my wooden door. I wasn't upset yet. I wasn't even annoyed. The kid was late and saw my lights had just gone out and was trying to score one last handful of candy. I get it. The grind doesn't stop, right? I grabbed the bowl, slotted my fangs back into place, and turned the switch for the porch light. There was an electric crack as the bulb blew out. I laughed and reached for the door handle. At that moment, I was willing to bet that the light going out had totally made the kids Halloween. As soon as the door was opened, I realized how wrong I was. There wasn't a kid at all. There wasn't anyone. I called out, turned my head up and down the street to see if I could catch whoever had knocked and ran. The moment the lock on my door bolted into place, the phantom outside my door knocked again. I jumped. I spilled some candy. I laughed and cursed and scrambled to open the door a second time. Whoever this kid was, they had definitely gotten me back for the light bulb situation. It was dim when I opened the door, right? The porch light had gone out. The interior lights could only do so much to illuminate a kid who was standing outside. What I saw, I don't think it was a child at all. It was wearing a mask. It had to be wearing a mask. Whoever designed it definitely deserved an award of some kind. It looked like latex stretched over something that was vaguely the shape of a face, like a head made out of right angles concealed by this blanket of skin. Corners jutted out at the cheekbones and brow line. His eyes, large and deep-set, were jet black. Contacts, right? That's what I said. It's what I try to tell myself now. I didn't give this kid the Sesame Street skit. I held out the candy bowl and stood there slack-jawed. My body was going through the motions, but my mind knew something was wrong. I'd never felt fight or flight hit when looking at a child before, but I did this time. He didn't move. He didn't raise a candy bag or reach for a chocolate. He just stood there in his little hoodie. I didn't say anything either. I couldn't find the words. After a few long moments passed, I leaned back into my home and slowly shut the door. Another knock. Should have taken the candy the first time, kid. I reached for the door, inexplicably angry this time. How had he gotten under my skin so quickly? When it swung back, whining on its hinges, I froze again. There were 5 of them, identical and standing shoulder to shoulder. If my mind had been alarmed before, it was full-on panicking now. I chose flight 1,000 times over and slammed the door shut. I've seen that movie, right? No way is that happening to me. When I turned around, eager to retreat into the safety of my own home, one of them ran past me. across the hallway from the kitchen to the living room, one of those little devils. I knew it was the first kid. I've never turned the lights on in my house more quickly. I searched and I searched, but ultimately came up empty-handed. He got in when the door was open, I knew, but how he'd gotten out? I have to tell myself he got out. It's the only way to get through my day without fearing each shadow in the corner of my eye. He's out there. I'm in here. And I'm not opening my front door for a child ever again. I tried reintegrating into my neighborhood's Halloween activities. I told myself that I was probably misremembering the whole ordeal. I must have built it up into a nightmare over the course of the pandemic. This year, for the holiday, I tried sliding candy through the mail slot whenever someone knocked. The parents didn't appreciate that. Then at the end of the night, the kids came back, sliding their crooked fingers through that same hole, scratching at the metal frame. That's when I decided to quit. Every night, I know they're standing there. Sometimes one, sometimes five. They're still out there and they still want in. This happened quite a few years ago now. I was working as a middle school science teacher in North Carolina. The town I lived in wasn't anything to write home about, but I was only about an hour's drive from the coast. But even more exciting, at least exciting to me, were the wildlife refuges. You see, I'm a biologist, and exploring the wild, swampy areas of the state became my weekend entertainment. I grew up in central Idaho, smack in the middle of the Rockies. I did my undergrad studies there and then went to Washington State for graduate school. I, never in a million years, thought I would end up in North Carolina. I'll be honest, I wasn't too excited when I got the job. I had been looking for work for over a year with dismal prospects. So to North Carolina, I went. I admit the climate is not my favorite. There is a heaviness to the air that never seems to let up. Coupled with the heat of summer, it's hard to convince myself to even go outside some days. But the wilderness areas are magical, 100% worth braving the humidity and the summer sun. One of my favorite things to do was find and watch the black bears. From a distance, of course, they are such fascinating creatures. The black bear population here is one of the densest in the world. Luckily, black bears tend to be skittish and easily frightened by humans. I don't know how many bears I've seen in the Carolina wetlands, but it has to be upward of 100 by now. However, the reason I wrote in was not to tell you about black bears. There is something else that lives in the swamp. The day started out like any other of my wilderness adventures. The kids had just gotten out of school for the year, and I had 2 weeks before summer school began, so this was one of the rare occasions I was able to go hiking on a weekday. The weather was forecasted to be hot, sticky, and generally unpleasant by midday, so I had started my hike early. I knew the area well, and none of the trails were too strenuous. The path I had planned would take me through the forest and around the perimeter of a swamp. If you've never been to this part of the world, you might imagine swamps to be dull or maybe creepy, but here they are, vibrant and full of life. I had hoped to see a bear or two that day. My walk through the forest was uneventful, and thinking back on it, nothing strange at all stood out to me. When I reached the beginning of the wetland, it was alive with croaking toads and birds darting every which way. Everything seemed completely normal. And then I saw it. A black bear. It was almost too far away to even notice, but it was most definitely a bear. My path along the swamp would take me closer to it. Not close enough to bother it, but just enough to get a better look. The bear was close to a grove of trees, almost hidden in the shadows, but it seemed to be moving, albeit slowly, towards the opening of the swamp. It took me nearly 20 minutes of hiking to get close enough to notice that there were actually 2 bears. I was about as close as I was comfortable to the bears when I stopped and rested on a fallen tree to watch them. I could see something else moving in the shadows behind the trees when a 3rd bear emerged. For a moment, I thought things were about to get interesting, but the bears seemed to keep to themselves. Black bears are typically solitary creatures, so what I was witnessing was nothing short of remarkable. But was as strange as it was exciting. I realized I had not seen one of the bears lift its head above the swamp yet. Bears do regularly graze on plants, but still, this was odd behavior. I decided to stay and watch the bears as long as they would allow it. I noticed more movement in the shadows of the grove, and yet another bear emerged. To say I was stunned would be an understatement. None of these bears acknowledged each other. They were just peacefully coexisting. I sat there on that dead tree for over an hour, I'm sure. And by that time I counted the outlines of 12 bears grazing together in the swamp. Their behavior was reminiscent of a herd of horses or cattle. It's not something I ever imagined I would see. I wondered how long I should sit and watch them. How long would they stay out here behaving like this? Would they just eventually wander back into the shadows? Unfortunately, my presence spooked a sandhill crane nearby, and the sound of it taking flight alerted the group of bears. I looked towards the bears and expected to see 12 faces suddenly staring in my direction, but that is not what I saw. The bears, or what I thought were bears, all simultaneously stood up. I know what a black bear looks like when it stands up on its hind legs, and these things, they weren't bears. They weren't apes either, or any type of monkey. They looked like men covered in thick black hair. As soon as they saw me, the entire group ran back to the cover of the trees. I don't know if they were Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but that's what they looked like. I've never heard of those creatures living in groups, but then again, I've never met anyone else who actually saw one. It was an unnerving experience, but I think they were more frightened when they saw me than I was when I saw them. It was 1975, and we were just kids living in the suburbs of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'd say we were around the ages of 10 and 12. Basically, we were old enough to ride around on our bikes without supervision, but looking back, we weren't old enough to fully comprehend what had happened that day. My friend and I had been wanting to go for a bike ride for a while. I got a new bike for my birthday, so I really wanted to test it out. There was this area that we knew about. It was typically for older kids, but I had heard my sister talking about it, and I really wanted to go. So, my friend and I gathered some snacks and comic books, and we decided that we were going to go up there for a few hours. I had told my mom that we would be at their house, and they told their mom that we would be at my house. It was your typical lie you'd tell your parents to allow yourselves enough time to do whatever mischief you had set out to do without getting in trouble. So, we met at the park. At this point, we are really excited to start our adventure. The only issue was we had to be back home before dinner, and we definitely had to be back before the older kids went up there. Basically, we went up there before it started to get dark. But the sky was already turning an orange color, so we knew we didn't have much time. I guess we were so excited about our trip that we wasted a good amount of it packing things we wouldn't really need anyways. So we start riding our bikes. Like I said, the sky had a bit of orange, but the sky was mostly still blue. It only took us about 10 minutes to ride our bikes from the park to our destination, so it wasn't too difficult. We get to the spot, and at first, I'm looking at this place like, is this really where the older kids hang out? It looked pretty gross, and the place reeked of sewage. But basically it looked like some type of creek with a strange cement tunnel. But I looked at my friend. They gave me the thumbs up, meaning that this was indeed the place. My friend looked excited, so I tried my best to look excited too, even though I was slightly disappointed. We parked our bikes up on the slope. And as the slope went down, it created a type of creek, like I said. So we grabbed our backpacks and headed down to the area towards the creek and tunnel. As we got further down, the smell just got worse and worse. But it didn't seem to bother my friend, and I didn't want to seem like a wimp, so I tried not to let the smell bother me. We get to the tunnel, and you can tell that teenagers hung out down there. The walls were covered in profanity, images of women's breasts and what have you, and there were a bunch of cigarette butts and alcohol cans all over the place. We did feel a little cooler since we actually made it to the place and had a better idea of what went on there. We decided that the tunnel would be like our fun clubhouse, so we found a decently clean area to set our stuff down, and we started unpacking our things. The sky was much more orange now, so we knew we wouldn't be able to stay much longer. But I like to draw, and I wanted to try and redraw some of the stuff I saw on the walls. So I'm doodling away, me and my friend are giggling, just having a good time in the tunnel. And every sound is really amplified there. So our laughter is just so loud. I'm actually really surprised that my parents didn't hear us all the way to my house. That's how loud everything sounded. Anyways, we are laughing, and I sort of hear the faint sound of like footsteps. So I stopped laughing. My friend stops too, and they look at me. I think they were confused, but I was really nervous that the teenagers had found us, or that someone, like an adult from the area, caught us doing things we shouldn't be doing. So my heart is just racing. I whisper to my friend, "We should start packing up." They nod, and we start stumbling around trying to get all of our things. That's when I heard it. It sounded like a woman's heels on cement. It sounded like they were in the tunnel with us. I start freaking out because I really didn't want to get into trouble. I just got my new bike. My parents were finally letting me be gone till dark. So I turn around. Down the tunnel to the farthest side that we had not ventured to, there was the silhouette of something so strange. I can't really explain it all that well, but I'll do my best. It was somewhat hunched over, or it looked hunched over to me at least. It appeared to have hair on its head, and honestly, it seemed to go onto its shoulders and back. Let me rephrase. It didn't have long hair. The hair was somewhat short and matted down, but it looked like they had hair growing from its back and shoulders too. Its legs, they weren't human. They looked like they belonged to a goat or horse. And these, too, had hair that seemed to be a similar length as the top of its head. And on the top of its head, it appeared to have two pointy objects sticking out from the hair, with what looked like two ears that seemed again like they belonged to a goat. So I'm thinking to myself, is this a goat? But that's when the thing stood up tall on its hind legs. And it definitely wasn't a goat. But it absolutely wasn't a human either. I looked at my friend, and they were shaking. The thing took another step towards us, and we didn't give it more time for another. We took our backpacks and ran. We ran so fast, I honestly couldn't even remember going back up that hill or riding our bikes home. I'm not sure what was down in that tunnel, but I was certain that I would never return. And I haven't. So, all this happened on a fishing trip I took to Canada with my dad. We have been doing this trip for years now, basically since I was in elementary school. It's one of the things I've looked forward to the most each year. I really don't know if anyone has ever had an experience quite like this. I tried to search around on the internet, but there wasn't really much out there. If you've ever seen something like this, I'd really like to hear from you. That's why I'm putting this story out there like this, because I want to know if anyone else has ever seen the same thing. For years and years, we always went to the same lake system in rural Quebec. This past year, we had to go to a different lake because the cabin we've always used got booked up too fast. Everyone is obsessed with outdoor vacations since COVID, so that makes it really hard to get reservations and all that. We found a different cabin to rent in the same general region. It was definitely more remote than our usual cabin. At the old place, we could just drive up and park. It was kind of in a cluster of cabins and not super far from a small town. At this new place, we actually had to park the car and boat out to the cabin. It was on the far side of the lake and had a much more remote feeling. This lake was definitely shallower than the one we were used to. Lots of lakes are surrounded by a little marshland, but this lake had tons of it. It wasn't very forested, just marshland as far as you could see. It stank too. Both my dad and I agreed that we wished we'd researched the lake a little more, but it had been a last-minute booking. Some locals told us it was still good fishing, and we hoped that would be the case. We loaded our stuff into the fishing boat and motored across the lake to our little cabin. When we unloaded our stuff out of the boat, I noticed some really weird depressions in the mud. They were really big and really wide. There also appeared to be 3 very distinct branches on the imprint, almost like it was a massive footprint with splayed toes. I really didn't know what it was, so I didn't think very much of it. We just kept unloading the boat, and I think we destroyed that mark in the mud with our own footprints. It was late already when we got to the cabin, so we did not get to fish at all that first night. My dad and I cracked some beers and sat on the porch of the cabin, looking out over the lake. It was really, really quiet. Normally, lakes are loud with bugs and frogs and birds. This one was strangely silent. I wouldn't say it was eerily silent, but it was definitely weird. I remember one distinct sound, a long, low, deep thrumming sound that was very consistent. It was a few days later that I actually saw it. We were renting the cabin for a week, and our first few days of fishing were all right. I caught a handful, but my dad didn't really catch anything. This lake was definitely shallow, and the fish didn't seem very big at all. One thing I did like about the lake was that it was relatively clear, due in part to its shallowness. This is why I was able to see that creature. It was midway through the week, and we were over by the north shore of the lake. We hadn't fished here yet, and my dad was hopeful that maybe he could finally reel something in. We both were unlucky all morning, not catching a single fish. I could see them down there, but nothing was biting. Suddenly, all the fish darted away, like they all swam away as fast as possible, as if they were being chased. I was leaning over the side of the boat, trying to see if there were any left down there when it came up by our boat. It was the largest, most gruesome creature I've ever seen. It looked absolutely disgusting and had an evil sense to it. It was the sort of thing I could imagine First Nations people creating stories about to warn their children. It was probably 10 feet long and covered in massive, gross-looking warts. Its legs were probably 1.5 times the length of its body and ended in webbed feet with huge, razor-sharp-looking talons on the end. Those claws were probably as long as a steak knife. Its head was the most disgusting and terrifying part. Had big yellow eyes, probably the size of a soccer ball. Perched atop its eyeballs were long, thin spines that looked like horns. This monster swam right below our boat, probably 20 feet down. I don't know if it was aware of us or not, but I did know that this was what those fish had to have been running away from. We watched as it swam away and then turned on our motor and went to a different part of the lake. I don't think I was afraid of it until that night. At first, it just seemed like we'd seen a really cool piece of wildlife, something to report to National Geographic. That night, though, both my dad and I saw it again, and it left us terrified. We were sitting on the porch, enjoying another beer. As the sun set, that long, low thrumming began again, the same thrumming we'd heard the night before. It seemed to be getting louder and louder, and my dad and I were trying to see where it was coming from out across the lake. As we strained our eyes to see in the darkness, something happened that shocked and terrified us both. Probably 100 yards out, in the middle of the lake, those big yellow eyes appeared. They were staring straight at us, and that thrumming got louder. It knew we were here, and it was watching us. That absolutely freaked us out, and we both went inside and locked the door. We left the next day, and I don't think we'll be going back to that particular lake. I don't know if what I saw was just some freak of nature that had been alive too long, or if it was some sort of ancient spirit. Either way, it really freaked me out. My girlfriend Maria and I both work in healthcare, and the pandemic was, honestly, rough for us. We both got really burned out, especially Maria, since she had taken a job as a travel nurse for about 6 months. It ended up not working out, and she came back home to settle in at our local hospital, which is where we met and work now, in different departments. Luckily, Maria made so much money doing the travel nurse gig that we were able to set some of it aside for a vacation once things calmed down a bit. So about a month ago, we decided to finally pull the trigger, take time off, and get away somewhere. We live in Tucson, Arizona, so heading south to Mexico seemed like a good idea for an easy and quick 5-day vacation. After looking around for a bit, we decided on Puerto Penasco, which isn't too far from us, and the area around it also had some places nearby that we wanted to check out. Even though we had some extra spending cash, I grew up very frugal, and when booking our Airbnb, kept that in mind. I ended up finding a nice condo that was away from the main resort area of the town, but still near the water. We packed up and headed out, arriving the same day. In real life, the condo was a little more run down than we'd expected and missing some key features like dish soap and extra towels. Maria and I are both pretty laid back, so we made do and started looking around for a place to go out to dinner. We wanted to avoid the really touristy restaurants but still get good food, so it took a while for us to make a decision. Eventually, around 6:30, we agreed on a food truck that was supposedly nearby, about a 10-minute walk. The sun was starting to go down soon, and after looking at the GPS on our phones, we decided we could stick to more populated streets versus a scenic walk to the food truck. First, we had to walk out of our neighborhood and cut up a path through the sand dune area. And then we'd end up in a little bay area where the food truck was parked near the water. When we arrived, there were other people out and about, so I wasn't too worried, and eventually we got our food and sat down on a bench to eat. We hung out in that area for almost 2 hours, and at around 8:15, decided to head back and get some sleep. Maria took the lead, and I followed. As we were coming down the sandy spots, I heard a dog start to yap in a way that made my anxiety spike. I grew up with an overprotective dog and recognized the bark as a kind of warning bark, so I stopped and started to look around. Maria told me she felt it was fine and not to worry, and just keep going. But within a few seconds, at least 2 other dogs started barking furiously too. We were just about at the bottom of the dunes, and I almost tripped trying to hurry. This area wasn't well lit, and I just wanted to get to the sidewalks. A car drove by, and I felt a little bit better. We made it about 2 or 3 streets away from the condo, and were looking at the closed businesses as we passed, talking about what we should do tomorrow. That's when I glanced down a side alleyway and froze immediately, seeing a dog in the shadowed area. Maria also stopped to see what I was looking at and held my arm a little tighter. "Come on," she said, "let's keep going. It's just a dog." But just as those words left her mouth, 2 more appeared in the same spot, and then another. They all looked our way and started walking toward us. They were only maybe 100 feet away. Now Maria and I kicked it up a notch and really started hurrying back to the condo. I was thinking this was a pack of stray dogs following us and was a little worried knowing stray dogs can be aggressive. I glanced back as we got onto the road that the condo was on and saw that the pack of dogs was still following us. But what stood out to me was that every dog, there were 5 of them in total, looked exactly the same. They were huge, easily up to my hip, and I'm 5'11". I pulled on Maria's arm and told her to stop and look. We stared at the dogs who were watching us with their heads lowered and their eyes literally glowing. Not that normal green-yellow reflective glow that dogs get at night, but a reddish-orange glow. There were other dogs nearby barking, but this pack of 5 dogs was completely silent and still as they watched us. They had long bodies, long tails, and short black hair. I noticed that one had a cropped ear. Maria and I finally got back to the condo and let ourselves in quickly. There were streetlights in this area, and we looked out from inside to try and see the dog pack again, but they didn't come out onto the street. We stayed up late talking about the dogs and what they might have been. I'm 100% convinced these weren't just regular stray dogs. First of all, they all looked exactly the same, like clones of each other. And the red eyes are an indicator to me that we were dealing with something paranormal, not natural. In my opinion, I think we came across a pack of hellhounds, although I have no idea what they were doing in Puerto Penasco. Maria didn't agree and still insists we just saw a pack of strays. Either way, for the rest of the trip, we either ate close to the condo or took our car out when we were going out at night. This was supposed to be a vacation for us to blow off some steam, but I spent most of the time thinking about those supposed dogs and trying to reason out what we had seen.